The Apostle Paul is without a doubt the most influential Christian in all of history. Not only did he write about half the New Testament, he spent his life traveling all across the Roman Empire, spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ and helping to start churches in all sorts of cities. A lot of our Christian theology and practice can be traced back to Pauline traditions. And there are some Christian traditions who follow Paul's interpretations of Jesus more closely than the actual words of Jesus. He's a polarizing figure whose teachings have been called both regressive and progressive, depending on who's asking. But we're not going to get into all that today. Today we're going back to the beginning, when Paul was still going by the name Saul. We're revisiting how Saul became Paul and his legendary, larger-than-life conversion story on the road to Damascus. If you know nothing else about Paul, you probably know this story, which makes it the perfect story for us as we continue our Back to Sunday School series, a series in which we take well-known foundational stories in the Bible and give them a second look to see what they're actually about. Today's story goes like this. One day, Saul and his merry band of persecutors were on their way from Jerusalem to Damascus. Saul had learned that a group of Christians were in Damascus, and he wanted to find them and throw them in jail. He was almost to Damascus when suddenly a bright light from heaven surrounded him. Acts 9 says, he fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led them by the hand to Damascus. Saul stays in Damascus for 3 days, completely blind, and he fasts and prays. Finally, a Christian named Ananias bravely answers God's command to go to Saul and heal him. Ananias prays for him. Saul's sight is restored. Ananias baptizes Saul immediately, and the rest is history. Probably the most popular interpretation of this story is about God's amazing grace and ability to forgive even the worst of sinners and use them for God's glory. Saul is living proof that no one is beyond redemption. Today, however, I really want to start by looking at everything that led up to Saul's Damascus Road moment. Who was he, and how did he become the kind of person who persecuted people? We first meet Saul a few chapters earlier in Acts at the stoning of Stephen. Stephen was a prominent leader in the early church who was arrested for teaching about Jesus in the synagogues and charged with blasphemy. Stephen was sentenced to death by stoning. Interestingly, the religious governing body at the time was not authorized to give the death penalty. Only the Roman authorities could do that. But that didn't stop the religious leaders, and it seems the Roman authorities looked the other way. It's important to understand the situation for early Christians at the time. In the beginning, Christians were not considered a separate religion. They were a sect of Judaism that believed that Jesus was the promised Messiah, as evidenced by his death and resurrection. Other sects of Jews, like the Sadducees and Pharisees, had different beliefs about the existence of an afterlife and the possibility of resurrection. They viewed Christian Jews as heretics and blasphemers, though Sadducees and Pharisees had different levels of tolerance for their existence. There were also, of course, political and social factors at play, and added all together, the Christians became targets for persecution. Stephen was one of those Christians, and we are told that Saul, a young Pharisee at the time, stands and watches over everyone's coats while they gather round and cast stones at Stephen until he is dead. This event apparently ignites something within Saul, and he becomes zealous in his persecution of Christians. The Sanhedrin, the governmental board of Judea during the Roman occupation, grants him permission to do what he needs to do to squelch this new Jewish sect. Saul does everything he can to fulfill this mission. He goes from house to house in Jerusalem, drags men and women and puts them in prison. He visits synagogues and tries to trick the Christians hiding there into blaspheming so he can punish them. He actively votes in favor of them receiving the death penalty at their trials. His work totally consumes him. Later in Acts, he says, "I was so obsessed with persecuting them that I even hunted them down in foreign cities." Considering all this, it's no wonder it took being literally stopped in his tracks by Jesus himself for Saul to reconsider everything. When talking about this moment on the Damascus Road, many Christians believe Saul's conversion was instantaneous, that the moment that bright light hit him and he heard Jesus' voice, he was a changed person. And that's certainly possible, but don't forget what follows after this moment. Saul loses his sight for 3 days. For 3 days, he sits in darkness, fasting and praying in an unfamiliar house in a foreign land. And during those 3 days, his heart completely changes. So for 3 days, Saul had nothing to do but sit with himself. And I wonder what those days were like. What was he thinking about? Was he afraid? Angry? Overwhelmed? What kinds of prayers was he praying? I imagine he did a lot of reflecting on his life leading up to that point. He'd grown up in a devout Jewish family, and he entered his religious training with good intentions. Pharisees in particular were known for their scholarly study of Jewish law and scripture, so we can assume that Saul was a pretty smart guy, someone who took his religious beliefs very seriously. For all of its faults, the law spelled out in the Torah was ultimately about being in right relationship with God, other people, and creation. The law set out provisions for how to care for society's most vulnerable and stand up for what is right. The law talked about loving God with all of your heart, mind, and soul. Saul believed in all of this so deeply that he devoted his life to following the God of Israel, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who'd led his people out of exile and given them a new way of living. I wonder what it was like for him to realize that somewhere along the line he'd lost the plot, that he'd become someone he didn't even recognize, doing things that he never imagined he'd do. He'd become a murderer in the name of his God, twisting his religious beliefs to justify his hatred and his violent actions. He'd forgotten that central thesis of the Torah as summed up by Jesus: love God and love your neighbor. Instead, his neighbors became people to fear and hate, people that he had to protect God from by getting rid of them. Somewhere along the line, he'd turned all that love into hate. What happened to Saul isn't unique or singular, and it didn't happen overnight. Saul was born around the same time as Jesus, possibly a few years later. And though Saul never encountered Jesus face to face during his earthly ministry, Saul had no doubt heard about him and his followers. He came from a family of Pharisees, so he probably grew up hearing all about the conflicts between the Pharisees and the nascent Jesus movement. He grew up hearing that these Jesus followers were heretics who posed a threat to Judaism as a whole. It also didn't help that most of the early Jesus followers were societal outcasts, people already living with stigma. That hate, that bias and prejudice took root in Saul's heart until one day he stood watching a brutal mob execute Stephen for his beliefs, and instead of being horrified by the violence, he was motivated to perpetuate it. Hatred is insidious like that. Very rarely do we wake up one day and decide we hate an entire group of people. It's something we learn over time, maybe even unconsciously. As a country, we've learned to hate all kinds of people throughout the years. The original colonists saw indigenous Americans as barbarians and heathens. White Americans saw black people as less than human, leading to hundreds of years of enslavement, segregation, and violent discrimination. 9/11 taught us to demonize Middle Eastern people and Muslims. Today, we've been told to fear and revile LGBTQ+ people, especially trans people. We've been told all kinds of horrible and untrue things about immigrants. And this hateful rhetoric, these hateful stereotypes, has led to violence every single time. Because the end game of hatred is always pain and death. And unfortunately, there have been many times where we, like Saul, use our Christian faith to baptize our bigotry and call it holy. It's a trap that any of us can fall into, and while most of us don't end up literally hunting people down to murder them like Saul did, we all have the potential to participate and enable the larger systems that do. And if we're not careful, we can all find ways to twist the words of the Bible to make our discrimination or lack of intervention okay in the eyes of God. Saul's Damascus Road moment wasn't about converting him to believing in God. He already believed in God as a devout Jew. His Damascus Road moment was about recognizing the way his beliefs had been so distorted by hate that he was actually going against the God he claimed to love. Jesus asks Saul, "Why are you persecuting me?" Echoing his words in Matthew 25 when he's talking about feeding the poor and caring for the vulnerable and says, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me." On that Damascus Road, Jesus reminds Saul that whenever he arrests, degrades, murders these people that he hates, Saul is actually doing those things to God. In the very beginning of the Torah, in Genesis, it says that all people are made in God's image. All people have a sacred dignity. And somewhere along the line, Saul forgot that. Saul bought into the lie that some human lives are worth more than others. Hate and bigotry aren't going away anytime soon, and we will be exposed to it throughout our lives. But we don't have to become like Saul. We can make a conscious choice not to give in to fear and to question the narratives we hear about entire groups of people. And like Saul, we must encounter Jesus over and over again on that Damascus Road and be reminded that how we treat others is how we treat God. We must be reminded of the sacred worth of every single person we meet, whether they look like us, sound like us, love like us, or not. So what happens if you already look in the mirror and don't recognize yourself anymore? What happens if you're in a space where you have anger towards or dislike a particular group of people based on what you've heard about them? What happens if you've been causing harm with your words or your actions? Then I'd like to invite you to consider this a Damascus Road moment. You don't have to be that person. You can change your mind and change your ways. You can work towards reconciliation and redemption. Like Saul, you can encounter Jesus and remember who you are. It won't be simple. There will be wounds to heal and consequences to face for the harm you've caused. But there is a way forward, and it's worth the effort. Life is better when you're not carrying around all that anger and hatred and fear. Now, there is an unsung and often overlooked hero in this story. While Saul remains blind and praying in Damascus, Jesus appears in a vision to a man named Ananias. Jesus tells Ananias to go to Damascus, pray with Saul, and restore his sight. Initially, Ananias questions Jesus, saying he's heard of all the evil Saul has done against Christians. Ananias rightfully fears that Saul will arrest him or even worse. Jesus reassures him that Saul has changed and will now be an instrument of God's work in the world. I can't imagine the courage and faith it took for Ananias to go to Saul, even after Jesus' words. He was asked to help this person who had caused so much harm to his community. He may have even lost people he loved thanks to Saul's actions. Still, his faith teaches him that redemption and reconciliation are possible. So he extends that grace to Saul, and Saul is once again forever changed. We need Ananiases in our lives, just as sometimes we need to be Ananias to someone else. People who are willing to offer us grace while also holding us accountable. People who are willing to say or do the difficult thing because it's the right thing. And when those people show up, we need to listen to them. I get that it's hard to admit when we're wrong. It can sting our pride or fill us with shame, but the ultimate opportunity is restored relationships and a life that truly reflects the love of God. And it's worth it every time. The story of Saul on the Damascus Road is a powerful example of redemption and grace. From Saul, we learn that it is possible to change your mind when presented with new information. We learn that being called out or held accountable for causing harm is a gift. Saul could have ignored Jesus or refused to change out of embarrassment or shame at learning that he was wrong. Instead, he owned his mistakes and all the terrible things he'd said and done. He changed and spent the rest of his life preaching about the expansive love of God for all people. His change of heart inspired others to change as well. He didn't always get it right, but he made a long-lasting impact on the story of Christianity that we experience to this day. Throughout our lives, we will experience multiple Damascus Road moments. They may not be as dramatic as Saul's, but they are no less important to our faith journeys. My hope and prayer is that we will be open to receiving them when they happen, so that we may become the people God has called us to be.